Boop, 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 boop-a-doop, boop-a-doop. I'm doing my own theme music, and that is how you know that I have hit rock bottom. How are you doing all tonight? We are going to be doing another live as it is Tuesday night, and from 9 to 10:30 Eastern or 6 to 7:30 Pacific, where she is, we go live, and we're talking this week about Chapter 1 of the book, The Very Best Bad Idea, by me. But instead of me talking about it, I had Maggie read it because she's smarter and better than me in pretty much every way. So she reads it, tells me where I'm wrong, and we all agree with her. That's just kind of the way that it works. And here she is. Maggie, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing well. Give me a second. I'm going to make sure that I can hear you correctly. It's being all weird tonight. How is the West Coast?
It's good. It is what it is.
So I changed the settings, so you should be able to see the chat and such in the window this time. Can you?
Yeah, I believe I can.
Cool. So we don't have any comments yet, but like last time, I think that I had it set where that like only I could see the settings, but now I've made it so that everyone can see those. So cool. I was just doing an intro about how we're going to be doing Chapter 1 and kind of going through the book, and yeah, I should be better at this than I am, but I'm not. It's just so we're just going to kick it off kind of. Generally speaking, you've read the first couple of chapters of the book. Tell me about the book just at the begin, like your initial thoughts.
My initial thoughts.
Yeah.
My initial thoughts were, damn, he's spot on. I wonder how many people strongly disagree.
So far, I haven't had many hate, but I know that that's most people just being polite. Like, I don't think I've rustled up the trolls yet, which is one of the reasons I'm wanting to get more people. I'm wanting to get some dissent. I'm wanting to get people to really to come at me. I will say that there are some people that were interviewed for the book in later chapters that when they saw their chapter weren't as pleased by the points I was making. One group asked that I not use them, and I'm like, do I say anything that isn't true? And they're like, well, no, it's all true. I'm like, see, this is where we have a problem. You're not, so you don't disagree. And they're like, no, I totally disagree. You just don't say anything that isn't true. I'm like, right. See, so that's again, the problem. But those are later chapters. Well, cool. So, yeah. Again, I should be better at the cold open, but I'm really not. I'm a dive right in kind of person. I do have some cool things set up this week. So if we want to check things, I can do that this week, and I can pull up websites. We can check references. We can talk. Last time I was a little bit more, flustered and befuddled by things. This week I have it set up a little bit better for our general merriment and conversation.
Okay.
Cool. So kicking off Chapter 1, the history of thinking. Yeah, so I have mine as well. Let's just start off with initial thoughts, and cool. Aaron L., thank you for joining us. We have our first comment. So the book is called The Very Best Bad Idea. It's right here. It's about creativity and cognition. It's about the history of thinking and why we as a species are so afraid of being wrong. Why we would rather do something we think is stupid than look stupid to people that we think are wrong. Why when we're standing in a room full of people doing things wrong, we will do it with them as opposed to saying, this is a bad idea. And why that is an inherent trait. It goes into creativity, cognition, innovation, invention, and how we should actually respond to those things. That's kind of the short answer, but so yeah, we are. I will say right now, in a matter of just absolute self promotion, the website, The Very Best Bad Idea, is available there. You can get it on Amazon and anywhere books are sold. But right now, if you go on the website, Very Best Bad Idea, and use code TikTok, KTOK, which is where Maggie and I met. It's good for like 30% off. It makes it cheaper than Amazon, and it comes from me. And so it will be defaced with my signature if that is something that appeals to you in any way. Otherwise, Amazon's faster, but not defaced.
So I don't know who is watching and if they know who I am or anything.
Sure, let's start there. Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that I was excited about chapter 1 because I am currently a history major.
Sure.
And history, not just that, but history is my topic. It's like my thing. So I was excited by the chapter title itself. And I know that last week we talked about Charles Beard, like I mentioned, Charles Beard. But so you quoted him in here, written history as an act of faith.
Yes.
Every student of history knows that his colleagues have been influenced in their selection and ordering of materials by their biases, prejudices, beliefs, affections, general upbringing, and experience, particularly social and economic.
Yes. Would you disagree?
No. Okay. And if he has any sense of propriety, to say nothing of humor, he applies the canon to himself, leaving no exception to the rules. So, okay, like it goes on like this. But here's the thing that got me thinking within the context of that chapter, in the context of the book as a whole. Let me take these off because they're reflecting. The context of the book as a whole. This is something I actually find really fascinating about history. So in all of the history courses I've taken thus far, which aren't many, there is always that disclaimer that history, as we know it, as an academic field, as we're reading it, et cetera, is going to be biased. No matter, you can get the most unbiased author, it's going to have bias.
Sure.
And it's especially going to have bias from the person, from the time, et cetera. And so one of the things that popped into my head about in reading that chapter was, you're talking about how you're afraid of bees in the chapter. You're talking about why we want to conform, basically, why we want to be a part of the in crowd. And I find that this is true within academia. And we have this sort of idea that academic sources are infallible. They're good. They're better than, Wikipedia. They're better than a random YouTube video. But we have this sort of idea that they're infallible.
Right.
And they're not, especially modern sources, because we can look at the past and we can definitely judge, well, the science was wrong here because the history was wrong here because, but when it comes to our modern times, we have to understand that we may not be able to view the bias that the historian, the scientist is speaking with, because we have the same bias. Sure. And that was a very long way of me saying, I just wonder if you think, because this is what I was thinking, that our biases really speak to our desire to conform, to be a part of the group, that we're afraid to hold positions that wouldn't be welcomed by the group, even in things that we were supposed to not be biased about.
No, and it's really kind of, it's an interesting concept that throughout history, disagreeing with the group has literally never been healthy. Like the knee-jerk reaction has never been, well, Steve, I really appreciate your input and I'm going to think about that. It's been burn the witch. The person that has stood out with even when it was demonstratively better, they're like, no, kill that person. Like, being different than the group has been never, ever healthy. And that's interesting that on both sides, that we as society like to reject those that disagree. And as such, we as individuals like to keep our mouths shut when we do, because of just how unhealthy disagreeing would be. Charles Austin Beard, as he wrote a book that, again, I can never remember the title. It's like 16 words long. Where he talked about the founding fathers being just normal people, and people freaked out about it. And he was not discredited, but suppressed largely, because people wanted to think of George Washington as a Greek god. quite literally. I live in Washington, D.C., and there are literal edifices of him in a toga, like, which is embarrassing. It's just, if you go in the American History Museum, they have the first Washington Memorial, because now the Washington Memorial is the big spire thing that we've all seen. But the first Washington Memorial was a 12-foot tall statue of George Washington sitting on a throne with a sword and a toga. And you're like, that's just embarrassing. But it is, that's how we choose to remember these men. Thomas Jefferson in the Jefferson Memorial, him standing in a Greek pantheon. Like, we don't like people that disagree. And it's an interesting standpoint of, so what do we do about that? Do we keep our mouths shut, or do we go with the flow?
Well, since we're already circling back to Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers, you know, I think that this is also, it's really easy for us to sit here and talk about how Charles Beard was so great for his time, and he knew that the founding fathers weren't great and he got pushed back on. What I find interesting is that the concept of cancel culture, quote unquote cancel culture, is not new.
Right. No.
Obviously. But even today, we still run into that, because now we can agree with Charles Beard. Now the vast majority of us can agree that the founding fathers were problematic, that they had their issues. But now it's problematic to say that they had their virtues as well.
No, and yeah, absolutely. Now siding with them is dangerous. Now coming out and saying, like, you know, George Washington. Yeah, exactly. Now people are so quick. I was talking with a client actually this morning, and she made a really interesting observation that I had never personally associated before, and that is the association of the hipster woke culture and the cancel culture, and how now it's I am now woke. I have now become more enlightened, and therefore I must suppress any time before in which I was not, in which we accepted the lesser. I now see the problems of history, so now we must suppress the problems of history. And it's such an interesting dichotomy of, like, as a child, I liked George Washington. Now I know he was a slaveholder, so now we must never say anything good about him. And you're like, the pendulum went too far. Yeah.
Well, and the pendulum also is selective.
Interesting. Explain. Like, I know what you mean, but elaborate.
Well, I mean, we can say what we say about the founding fathers because they were rich white men.
Ooh,
but other folks who have bad, you know, problematic sides to them historically,
if I started talking bad about Frederick Douglass, I'd get in trouble.
Yes.
Again, I have nothing to say about Frederick Douglass. I'm just saying, I just like picked one. Like, interesting. I had never, you're right. It's okay to attack the founding fathers because they were in fact all rich white men. Huh. That had never.
Well, but we can't, you know, I brought this up last week too, but you know, then we have Margaret Sanger and her love of eugenics.
Right.
That we always sweep under the rug. I mean, even Susan B. Anthony was a problem. A lot of and this is actually something that bothers me when feminism comes up, because a lot of the, you know, founding mothers of feminism, the original feminists, even into second wave, had their problems, but we don't talk about those. And we certainly don't demand that they not be held to a high esteem.
What I think is interesting, and this is one of those things that I have to bring up very carefully, because it's 100% true and it's 100% verifiable, but I know that there are people that get really uncomfortable with it, is like, this isn't feminism, this is civil rights. But the fact that Rosa Parks was cast, like, that was a decision, that was my entire life. I was raised thinking, like, oh no, that wasn't a stand, that was just a tired old lady, and that's not true. It was an absolute orchestrated event. They chose who it was going to be. They chose when it was going to be. It was an orchestrated event. Now, as a PR person, bravo. But does that weaken it? And the answer is, it depends on who you ask. But it absolutely changes the narrative that it was not the tired laundry woman that the story said. It was an orchestrated event. does that change the narrative?
Well, and then, that's the problem. Sometimes we focus too much on one part of it. So we focus on the mythos of Rosa Parks,
Right.
instead of the entire point of what happened,
Right.
and what happened because of it, and all of those other things. Instead, we like to focus almost on the fantasy of it, just like with the founding fathers. We wanted to focus on the fantasy of their greatness, of them
Right.
being some like esteemed people, giants among
They
men.
were so woke. They were so enlightened. They saw the future. They were giants in their time. They absolutely weren't remarkably average white dudes of their time. Like, yeah, it's interesting how we celebritize. And again, I live almost walking distance from Mount Vernon. Like, literally, it's down the street, and it is so elevated. Even how normal they were, we like to skip it. We like to bury that, and it's strange that we do that. To me, it's strange that they can't be great if they were like us, because that makes us feel uncomfortable. They had to be better than us. They had to be different than us. We have to create that chasm, that distance,
Right.
or they're like, then why am I not doing good? It becomes an insecurity.
Well, we have to do that with monsters too.
I agree. That's a good point. We have to elevate their deviousness, their sinisterness. That we have to elevate that so that we don't see ourselves in them.
Which is a huge problem, because we are them. They are as much us as the greats. We are them.
Hey, Aaron, I'd love to hear you expound on that. I don't necessarily disagree, but I want to make sure I understand what you mean. Aaron L. just said, I feel like that falls under nationalism, and I don't disagree. I just want to make sure that, I want to make sure I know which part, because we have a little bit of a delay. I think you're about 30 seconds behind us. So I'd love to, they hear it about 15 to 20 seconds after we say it, and then their comment. So I don't quite know exactly which part, but I'd love to have you expound. Because yes, I think that, assuming that I know what you're talking about, I think that we do mascotify. That's a word. That's a straight up word. If it wasn't before, it is now. We do mascotify our heroes, and we caricaturize them to perfection, so that we can say America, I believe red, white, and blue, and have it be not a ridiculous statement. Because, yeah.
Well, and I think too, and I'm sorry, my camera, just 1 second, but I think too, one of the issues is that we oftentimes think that we're too smart to fall for that. And
Right.
we just so are not.
No, absolutely. Yeah. We love to think that our leaders are better than us, and our villains are worse than us, and that we are just, and it goes actually back to that whole thing. It's that those biases and those standing out. If you run faster than anyone else, you're too strong and you're a threat. If you run slower than everyone else, you're too weak and you're a threat. You're a liability. The safest place to be is nameless, in the center of the pack. Aaron L. responded, making George Washington a god makes the USA seem like there's a chosen land, like we're better than everyone else. Yes. Okay. 100%. Yes. If we elevate George Washington above King George, then we are the chosen land. We're the promised land. If we diminish King George, the madness of King George, and make him a raving lunatic, we can even better establish. I see the nationalism in that.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I also think that we do more than that. We assign a whole movement, a whole ideology, a whole nation to one person. This idea that it was King George who was doing these things. It was definitely King George, and only King George, who was making these rules. Like, I love that it wasn't King George, for example, who did the whole taxation thing.
Right. That was
I love that it was a prime minister who did it.
Right.
And who spearheaded it. But it was King George. And King George represented England as a whole, and oppression. And it just becomes it's so much easier to attack a person,
right,
than it is to attack a nuanced group of people.
And I mean, as we'll get on as we talk later chapters as well, but that again, this is so awesome because it goes the other way. It's also really easy to credit him. Steve Jobs is so great. He built the Apple like in his with like pocket lint and paper clips, and no, he didn't.
Great. Woz did, but okay.
Yeah, like we love to assign way more credit and way more blame to individuals than any individual has ever been worth ever. But it's an interesting habit of ours. But I was just reading somewhat recently, and I don't remember where, so please forgive the lack of citation, about how King George is way less to blame and was way earlier and more in favor of just be like, let him go. It's the colonies. Who the hell cares? And it was Parliament. Like it was the prime minister. That it was way less King George, but blaming the crown was just too easy. It was just...
And my favorite part is we talk about taxation without representation, these sound bites that are really, I mean, what are we, like 250 some odd years past this? And that sound bite is still just, it was a meme. It was a meme of its time. Right. And, but we don't talk about why they were being taxed, like why we were being taxed and how it was our own fault and how basically the Brits were like, hey, instead of us having to pay for the war you started and we had to fight, why don't you guys pay for it? Because literally the Brits, especially in London and the bigger areas, were suffering under the taxation of having to pay for a war that the American colonies started unjustly. Right. And yeah.
The other fun thing to that one is I can't imagine that you know this. Have you ever seen a DC license plate, a Washington DC license plate?
Just like once or twice.
Do you, by any chance, and again, this is such a setup question, do you happen to remember what it looked like? Anything says on it?
I thought that they were just plain like white, weren't they?
No, they have the DC flag, the 2 red stripes and the 3 red stars. And at the bottom, it says taxation without representation. Why? Because there are 700,000 citizens of Washington, D.C. They have no senators. They have no congressmen. They have no vote. The whole of government is in Washington, D.C. 700,000 people. They get absolutely no vote, but they are taxed just like everyone else. They are under the same rule, but they have absolutely no say. So, and that's been the case from the very beginning. So the second we get free of this thing under the banner of taxation without representation, DC wasn't our population for a little bit, but we set up DC. People immediately move in. We write this whole constitution of people will have this, and there'll be senators based on this and congressmen based on this, except if you live here. Now, we could get into the very obvious, because to this very day, about 45% of the district is African-American. Yeah. Like, it is remarkably minority. And for the record, it's only 45% now. That number has gone way down, like right. through gentrification over the last 20, 30, 40 years. It's fascinating to this day, 2021, we fought a revolution over this meme, taxation without representation, and then immediately did it. Immediately. And it hasn't changed.
Well, we didn't just immediately do it in Washington, D.C. We immediately did it everywhere. We immediately, sorry, one of the things that we did as well, we immediately started backtracking on states' rights.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. With the Sedition Act, we immediately started backtracking on free speech. And Jennifer Ransom just came in, which is why DC needs to be a state. That and Puerto Rico. I completely agree with you. And there's some movement going on about that right now. I mean, there's been movement on it for a very long time, but there's movement right now. Like, they're talking about it this week. I'd love to see DC made a state. I mean, I live in Virginia, but it's across the river. DC and Puerto Rico, these are people that have that they should get more of a vote and more of a say than they should. Yeah.
I guess my family has decided to move furniture. Sorry, guys.
I didn't hear it, so we're good.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and this is something that actually kind of drives me crazy about revolutions in general. Sure. Revolutions I agree with, revolutions I don't agree with, they always go to crap. They always turn into the exact same thing that they were fighting against. And that's not to say that it's not possible. Theoretically, it's possible for that not to happen. But as a history nerd, this is one of the reasons I get very nervous about people who are calling for revolutions or huge changes and things,
Sure.
because that actually never works out the way
I
you
mean,
think it is.
Fidel Castro overthrew, he was the savior of the people for like 15 minutes. Like coup
Well, so was
d'etats.
Hugo Chavez.
Yeah. Yeah, like coup d'etats almost never work out past for very long. I think someone, and again, this is gonna sound so star spangled awesome. I apologize if this is just my indoctrination.
Awesome.
So I should put it on a t-shirt, like star spangled awesome. Like I was reading somewhere that that the revolution of the United States is like making it the 200 years we did semi peacefully is actually kind of a record. Like as far as revolutions go, a revolution and an overthrow of and again, that could totally be not true. I just remember learning it at some point that like us making it 200 years to relatively we made it through the Civil War and we stayed one piece, like that we didn't crumble very quickly is interesting historically. I cannot back that up. Comments.
It is interesting if you frame it that way, but I would say that we have leaned on becoming our mother in order to make that possible.
I don't disagree, but expound.
Well, we've definitely tightened our fist, tightened our grip on the American people.
Sure.
We've gone back on. I think it's hilarious. I'm going to be totally honest here. I think the American Revolution was nonsense. I think it was a bunch of rich white guys throwing a fit over something that was just ridiculous. And the thing is, we have more to throw a fit over now from our own government,
Sure.
from our own star-spangled awesome government. And
it's gonna be a thing. We're gonna make that a thing.
That has to be. Awesome. We need shirts, and they need to. I wish. Do they still make those shirts with like lights? Remember, like in the night, with lights, like flashing. Anyway,
we're looking into this after the show.
So, yeah, like I think that there's a lot about American history that we don't learn.
Sure.
We don't learn. I mean, for example, right now, I just got through the Progressive Era, the Gilded Age, the Great Depression. The amount of bloodshed that happened during the labor movement and that caused the labor movement.
Okay.
Alone is fascinating.
I might not know about that. I mean, I only vaguely know what you're talking about.
And that's kind of it though. We don't really talk about that. We don't talk about the labor movement, the good, the bad, and the ugly on both sides that happen with that.
No, that's fascinating. You're right. It's really interesting. You and I had a conversation when we first started doing these. I think it was our very first on Instagram Live, like months ago. We were talking about how, like, why is it we talk so much about World War II and not World War I? Is it because the villain had a logo? Is it like, why is it, and not the atrocities of World War I were pretty significant. They were pretty insane.
They were
gas, the trench warfare. I mean, it was horrific. We don't really talk about World War I, but we beat the crap out of World War II. Again, I am not trying to elevate nor de-escalate World War, either one of them. But why is it that we talk so much about the Revolutionary War and so little about the War of 1812 or the French Indian War, or there's so much that we just like, oh yeah, and then over here something happened. And then we take these other moments and we elevate them to the point of remember the Alamo.
Mm-hmm.
And is it because those are the moments that help confirm the narrative? Is it like, why is it, as a marketing guy, as a communications guy, it's interesting how we have chosen these specific moments in history as foundational and pretend others either pretend they didn't happen or diminish them, like the labor movement thing.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with you, but I actually think that World War II, like Hitler and Nazism themselves, is such a unique thing that I don't think that we give enough credit to. So when people like to say, oh, he's literally Hitler, that person's so like Hitler, or you're a Nazi, it's like, no, actually, there's really not much that can compare to Hitler and Nazism. There really isn't. And I mean, I admittedly have a fondness for World War II. That sounds very odd, but I admittedly have a fondness for World War II. So my argument as to why we elevate World War II, I mean, I would say that there's several reasons, but I actually think that one of them is because it was so clear who the goodies and who the baddies were. It was so clear. And
it was really, really hard to there was very little nuance.
Right. And there's so much gray in this world.
Sure.
And in history, that being able to look at World War II and say, no, that's there's no, even the neo-Nazis have their own flavor of good and bad, but it's definitely black and white. There is not much gray during World War II. Now, there are things that we can argue. We can argue about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We can argue about the atrocities, the war crimes. We can even argue about what got us to World War II with the sanctions that we had put on Germany.
Right. Why World War II was why even happened. Right.
We can argue all of those little points, but on the grand scale, left, right, center, we all can agree that World War II was a great war. It was a very, heroic war.
Interesting.
It actually was one of the last times that we were true heroes.
Now,
truly heroes.
I know a lot of people that would disagree with you. I am not one of them because I'm not smart enough to have the information. But explain why. What was so specifically referring to America in this particular case? Like, we didn't know about the Holocaust. The American people didn't know about the Holocaust till the end of the war. So it wasn't a response to that. Like, we weren't rushing into a burning building explain what you mean by we were true heroes in that case.
Well, I mean, I wasn't just speaking of America.
Okay.
I was speaking of like the Allies, but I mean, you're right. Just taking America, because even without the Holocaust, what Hitler was doing was pretty bad. What the Axis powers were doing was pretty bad. And the reality is, we talk about how the American people didn't know about the Holocaust. The American people didn't.
Sure.
We actually knew quite a bit.
Sure.
We may have not seen the images. We may have not, known for sure what was going on. But we did know that suddenly the Jews were going missing. Suddenly these people over here were missing. I know that the Jewish community in America definitely knew a lot more because they were being written to. I know that the Catholic community knew a bit more because Catholics were dealing with and not to the level of the Jews. I'm not trying to say that at all, but there was definitely an anti-religious pushback in Poland, etc. So we knew that there was, and not to sound incredibly Star-Spangled Awesome here, but there was a threat to freedom that was happening, but in a very real way, not in a I have to wear a mask way, in a I don't want to be disappeared way. I didn't want to cease to exist to make room for these people way.
One of my favorite books actually is called The Devil's Chessboard, The Devil's Chessboard, and it is about it's a biography of Allen Dulles, who founded the CIA, and and he was one of I can't remember his name all of a sudden. He was in the OSS in World War II, and he absolutely knew about the Holocaust and absolutely reported the Holocaust. He's like, this is happening. We should do something about it. And it was sort of suppressed. Like, we don't need that getting out. Again, which is one of the reasons it's called The Devil's Chessboard, is about Allen Dulles and just the things that went on that we knew about that we didn't talk about as openly.
Well, it's more than just the Holocaust as well. We have to remember, and don't get me wrong, I think that there's definitely, we definitely need to criticize the American response to the Holocaust, or lack thereof.
Sure.
But it wasn't just the Holocaust. There was also other things that America was ignoring, like what was happening to Britain, one of our greatest allies. We were completely ignoring what was going on with them.
Referring to bombings, or referring the Blitz, or what are you referring to exactly?
The Blitz, they were engaged in the war long before we were.
Absolutely.
And they really had their back up against a wall. Frankly, it's kind of amazing that Britain is still standing. Honestly, with how crazy that got. We turned our backs on them too, which, by the way, we've been doing since the jump. The French helped us, and then we turned around and said, "Oh, you're having a revolution too? I'm sorry, who is this again?"
It was funny, that same conversation with that client this morning that was talking about the woke culture and cancel culture. We were talking about that. She is from Sweden, like born and raised in Sweden, and she's lived all over the world and is just in the US right now. And we were talking about how, she lived in France for a while, and what they teach the American Revolution in French public schools, because of course they do. And their take on the American Revolution is quite different than ours.
Those the Brits.
Yeah, they do not teach the same narrative we do.
No.
Because it's not just history is written by the winner, because the loser didn't get eradicated. The loser still gets to tell the story too.
Well, it's really interesting to me that even at the college level, we talk about the revolution in a completely different way.
Say that again?
Even at the college level, we talk about the revolution in a completely different way.
Interesting. So Jeff Carpenter just commented, World War II is so important because we live in a society that was created by boomers from top to bottom. So, of course, the war that their daddies won is going to be the most important thing of all time. That is really true. That is like my dad was born in 48. My mom was born in 49. They are the epitome of boomer. Like they are that wave. My grandparents, both of them fought in the war. Actually, one of my grandmothers was in the Women's Army Corps. Like, I grew up having that idealized just from a cultural standpoint. That makes a lot of sense that boomers framed our nation as it stands currently. I like that perspective. That's a cool point, Jeff.
I'm going to push back on it.
Please. This is why I talk to you. Hit me.
Okay. So I have a few issues with this. I'm not saying it's entirely wrong, because it's not. But I have a few issues. One, to follow that logic, World War I would also have to be viewed with a level of importance. My grandmother was a boomer. Her father fought in both World War I and World War II. We don't hold World War I to nearly the level of importance. Interestingly enough, neither do my great-grandfather very rarely talked about World War I, but he talked about World War II a lot. I find that really interesting.
I do too, interestingly. Yeah.
The second point is that when we talk about World War II and the importance of World War II, what I find really fascinating about that is we don't just talk about the war and the battles itself. That's usually how we handle the way that we talk about most wars, especially things like World War I. But with World War II and with the revolution and with the Civil War, you'll notice that we talk about the reasons we were fighting, what we were fighting for, what we were fighting against, etc. We don't do that with World War I. And this is, again, I think one of the big reasons why it's not a big war for us, because there was no clear, this is what we're fighting for. It was a shit show. Anyway, but in order to argue that we focus primarily on World War II because of boomers, because it's the war that their daddies won, in order to argue that, we would have to be willing at least to argue that it has no other merit outside of that. And I mean,
okay.
Are we going to be willing to argue that World War II had nothing to offer besides that boomers' daddies won it?
No, I mean, and the other point, I still think there is merit to it, but at the same time, interesting. It's interesting also, I mean, I'm trying to think of where Vietnam plays into this as well, because
Vietnam is a shameful part of our legacy, and we didn't win it.
No, we didn't.
We didn't have any business there, and we did not win it, and that was an embarrassment.
No, that's true. So I want to kind of try to circle this back. This has all been fascinating, and I love all of it. But so it comes back to the whole the Charles Beard quote of the historian conceptualizing and understanding that even the histories we know, how much happened in World War II, World War I, Vietnam, that isn't even being discussed. That we even, Vietnam didn't happen that long before I was born. My father didn't, but could have fought in Vietnam. He was in the army. He just never, it was kind of he never made it to Vietnam just because of the way that things were happening at the time. How much do why, I'm trying to think of how to say this within the context of the Charles Beard quote that we opened up with, of using things in the context, we can only understand this from our 2021 perspective, from our 1980s, 1990s birth perspective. as much as I was raised by a boomer and talked to my grandfather, I will never know what it was like to live in the 1950s outside of I've watched Back to the Future. So clearly I know exactly what it's like to live in 1955. Like, I mean, I took the master's course on it. Marty McFly taught me. But even that's only conceptualized through the lens of modern understanding. I will never know what it's like to live then, just like my father doesn't, who is still alive, doesn't understand what it's like to be my age now.
Mm-hmm.
We're still very limited by the way we think and the way we perceive the world.
Absolutely. Well, and I think another thing though, you asked how much of it that we don't know. And
Sure.
there's definitely things that we will never know. Like you were saying, like the perspective of being, are you going to know what it was like to be a woman in 1955? No, never. I'm never going to know, I'm never going to know what it was like at Normandy. I've heard firsthand account, but I'm never going to know.
Sure.
But there are some technical things that we can know
Okay.
that we have found out about what happened during World War II, things that are really jarring. And one of the things that I'm not a World War II buff, my husband is though. And one of the things that really is unnerving, if you actually sit with it for a minute, is how close we came to losing.
World War II?
Yeah, okay, the Civil War, there was never a chance. The Civil War was almost a joke on the South's part. I mean, good on the Confederacy for sticking with it, but they never had a chance. World War II, we could have very well lost that war.
Okay.
And I'm sorry?
No, I said okay. Yeah, no, the Axis and Allies. Yeah, no, they were a formidable force. Yes.
Yeah, we could have very well lost. So, I mean, just even sitting with that, because I think one of the reasons why we have so much bias and we can sit and be like, World War II, is because we don't know how close we came. And another reason I think too is because there's something about the way that we talk about World War II in America, especially in American classrooms, that bothers me. Two things to be precise. And I have a theory as to why we do this.
Okay.
We really lean on the Nazis. We lean on the Nazis. We talk about how awful they were. Really easy to do. They're supposedly dead and buried. Really easy to do. We don't talk as much about Mussolini. We don't talk as much about Stalin. And we don't talk as much about the horrific atrocities of the Japanese Empire. One of the reasons I think that the older generation has such issues with the younger generation using the big bad C communist word or socialist word, that I think that the younger generation, my generation included, needs to understand is that they lived through some real atrocities committed by the Communist Party in Russia that we don't talk about because we would have to admit that we aligned ourselves with Hitler Jr. And we don't want to admit that.
Yeah.
We don't want to admit that. We don't want to admit that. I mean, Churchill, God love him, he had his own problems, but Churchill, I mean, he was really great at the epic quotes. And he
was, in fact, yes.
when he went to Russia to ally with them, he got pushback and he was like, I would go to hell and ally with the devil himself to get rid of Hitler. So he at least knew, he at least called a duck with what he was doing and allying with Stalin. But yeah, there's things that we don't realize that we were getting it from all fronts. It wasn't just the Nazis coming at us from, like the Eastern Theater. We had a lot of stuff. The Pacific Theater was pretty freaking bad. What was happening between Japan and China, with Japan as the aggressors, was really, really freaking bad. There was a lot of bad stuff going on.
Yes. No, there was a quote that I wanted to, also from the book, so I had to grab it. In sort of following up on that is, as we start talking about that, as we start reflecting on the war, it's interesting how quickly people become inflamed on, well, what you're saying is that we shouldn't have. people love to be offended. People love to be affronted by dissenting opinions. Oh, in any way. And so there's a quote again by Charles Beard. It is sobering to reflect that one of the best ways to get yourself a reputation as a dangerous citizen these days is to go about repeating the very phrases which our founding fathers used in the struggle for independence. It's that kind of going back to that whole phrase of that these were just guys, that these were just people, and they were kind of jackasses. And they disagreed that elevating any part of history to beyond refute, like you had talked about, like this person's a PhD, so clearly we can't disagree with him. Well, that person was there. So that person, well, that's a founding father. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin said it. George Washington. We elevate their opinion to unrefuted. Well, Churchill said it. Churchill found, and we elevate it so far forward. And it's interesting that the quickest way for us to alienate ourselves is to start disagreeing with people that other people agree with. And likewise, the quickest way to borrow esteem is to quote someone else massively out of context.
Yes. Yes. Well, and I think it's really, okay. So what Jeff said here about the only reason World War II is important was because created by boomers, our society, etc. So one of my knee jerks when I saw that was, I didn't think this, by the way, Jeff, if you're still here, I didn't think that Jeff was saying this, but I was thinking
just my business partner, by the way. So
I was thinking about what other people would think he was saying.
Sure.
And I have a point. Hold on. I was thinking that people are going to see that and say, oh, okay, so you didn't care about the Holocaust. Okay, I get it. So you're fine with the Jews dying. Kill them all, right?
Certainly not what he meant. Very much
No, it's not what he meant. However, I have seen this play out time and time again with the Civil War. So you'll get a group of conservatives, especially who are very states' rights, and they will say something like, the Civil War was unjust. The Civil War was unconstitutional.
Sure.
And people will rage. They will be like, we had to end slavery. Slavery was evil. I don't care if they broke the Constitution, etc. But there is a lot of conversation to be had around that.
Agreed.
Did we fight the Civil War because of slavery? Did we?
Oh, no, that's a baited question. I'm in Virginia. I can't answer that or I'll get attacked.
No. Did we?
I mean, the short answer is basically yes. There's fights to say that it is over states' rights, but the right that the states were fighting for was slavery, and that has been proven repeatedly and repeatedly. So you can it was over states' rights. Yes, it was the right to own slaves. You're like, right, but it could have been the rights to do anything, but it was over state. Yes, but the Georgia, it is in writing that several states entered for states' rights the right to own slaves. So
that was the crux of the issue. Exactly. The Articles of Secession themselves name slavery as the reason, to be able to hold the right to slaves as the reason that they were fighting against it. Does the person who says it was about states' rights, are they wrong?
No, which is why they do it, is that they can manage to stay a moral, not superiority, a moral flexibility to it. They're like, I'm not pro, it had nothing to do with slavery. Of course I'm anti-slavery. I'm pro state. It allows them the moral flexibility to be for one thing without being for the other.
Right. Well, and what's really interesting too is when you push back on them, I've noticed that the argument can go a few different directions. But one of my favorite directions is once you talk about how the secession of the states was because of slavery, then you get into but states' rights are important and we should have never. And then you have to ask, are states' rights more important than
human rights?
Slaves?
Right.
Do states' rights supersede human rights?
So, no.
And their answer is yes.
Yeah. And their answer is yes, absolutely.
Their answer is yes, because, not my answer, their answer is yes, because they fully believe that states' rights are sort of like a trickle-down liberty for the individual.
I like the way
you can't have personal liberty without states' rights.
So let me play devil's advocate, and let me just say up front that the white guy going devil's advocate on the Civil War against you is just not smart in any way. But I just let's pretend that's not from a federal level. Forget the state. From a George Abraham Lincoln, suspended habeas corpus and put people in jail, and did away with due process and did some. What about that though? Now we're talking, is it okay to throw the book out on the way things are supposed to work in order to do the right thing? Is the wrong thing okay? This becomes a bigger philosophical argument.
Basically, you're asking what Machiavelli alluded, did the ends
I guess I am, yes.
Do the ends justify the means?
Did they? I mean, it becomes
in the slavery situation, the fact that I'm sitting here talking to you right now, I mean,
so obviously, yes.
My knee jerk is going to say yes. My knee jerk is going to say yes, especially because what we have seen hasn't been a horrific abuse of the power that Abraham Lincoln exercised.
It absolutely didn't open up Pandora's box. It didn't turn into bedlam.
Which is one of the reasons I think this argument is so silly. Not your argument, just the argument from them is so silly, because it's like, but are we there though? But did that happen though?
Right. It's a slippery slope. Right. But it's 150 years, 200 years later, and we're not sliding. Yeah.
So, I mean, did we dodge a bullet? Maybe. But you know who else did? Millions of slaves.
Sure.
So it's like, do the ends justify the means? Do they? One of the big ones for me that I'm actually not entirely sure on, I can really honestly argue this either way. Should we? Was it necessary? Did we have to drop those bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
There are literal master's and doctorate level ethics classes on that question.
Yeah.
And this is where, to circle back to the whole concept of the book and the chapter we're talking about, I really don't know. And I mean, I mean that. This is not me having moral flexibility of like, I don't want to get caught answering that question. I mean, I really don't know.
I honestly don't know either.
I've never been alive during a world war, because as horrific as the global war on terror has been, it doesn't compare. It just doesn't. It doesn't compare to the world wars. It doesn't compare to the carnage. It doesn't compare to the number of people, leaving in busloads and the draft. It doesn't compare. I've never had to.
But there's another issue here too. Both of the arguments, both for and against those bombings, are very flawed. Because both of the so just being incredibly general here.
Sure.
Pro dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We had to. We killed a crap ton of people, but we saved the lives of a crap ton more.
Right.
The war would have kept going. Blah, blah, blah,
we saved millions of lives and shortened the war by 5 years. Or is like that.
The the war was already on its way out. We could have won without doing this, and the death toll all around could have been smaller. But here's the problem with both of those arguments. There is no way to prove either of those assertions.
Sure.
We honestly don't know.
It's Monday morning quarterbacking. Either one. Both of them are so flawed.
Yeah, both of them. We could have not done that and had a resurgence of Nazism and could all be speaking German and Japanese right now. Or we could have done it and turns out they were signing a peace treaty and we didn't know. I'm being extreme, but you know what I mean?
No, absolutely. And that's kind of my point, is that I have Monday morning quarterbacked everything from movie directing to conflicts and conflict resolutions on a much smaller scale. But I will say that, anyone who's ever had to do anything tough in that moment, you don't know. And I absolutely have no idea what it was like to be the military commanders or the president in that situation and know I'm about to drop the first of its kind nuclear warhead on a civilian population. Like that, we're the only people in history to have ever done that. Like no one has ever done it since. I mean, other than us the second time.
No one's ever done it since. Come on now.
Who else has dropped a nuclear warhead on a civilian population?
No, I'm saying don't tempt fate.
Oh, right.
Yet. No one has done it since. yet.
Fair enough. I thought you were saying that I was wrong. I'm like,
No,
I slept through history class, but I'm pretty sure it's only up.
Oh, yeah. Jesus, forgive him. He doesn't know what he's doing.
Jesus gave up on me a long time ago.
So yeah, okay. Yes, I completely agree. Like the, Monday morning quarterbacking, etc. Oh, and there goes my thought. Damn it.
Sorry.
There it went.
We look back at that as Americans, forget the rest of the world for a second, because Americans were really good at that. We as Americans look back at that moment with both either star-spangled awesome pride. I don't know that many people actually look at it with star-spangled, or just absolute horror at our actions. And it goes back to this whole chapter that we're talking, History 001, history taught by people in a way to prove their point. I have no idea what it was like to be there. We had been beaten down. There's so much context that we can't possibly know, or even worse, there's so much context that we do know that they wouldn't have had. Like that the men in these rooms, they didn't know about the little. We know because it's years later, and we've compiled data, and we have a bigger, more top level picture of what was going on in those moments than the men in those rooms had when those decisions were made. Okay. It is such Monday morning quarterbacking.
Well, and you're actually bringing up something that made me remember what I was going to say. I was going to say, we had no guarantee that Normandy was going to be successful. Oh, and yeah. I believe it was Eisenhower. It was General Eisenhower, right?
That sounds
I believe
right.
It was him. That was a hard one for him. If it was him. Yeah. Sending all those boys to their deaths. He didn't know if it was going to even work or if it would be worth it. He knew that he was sending so many young men to their deaths, but would it be worth it?
Right. And I mean, had that failed, like, just to think about, like, I've never had to make a like, we talk about dropping the bomb on an enemy population. He was sending his men, his boys, knowing they weren't going to come back. At least not all of them. Like, I've never, so one of my former military mentors was fairly high up. He was a general officer, and he had an office, a window office on the outer ring of the Pentagon on the Arlington Cemetery side. And he had to be in some fairly big decisions during the global war on terror, and nothing hugely impactful like Normandy. But he said that one of his practices was anytime he had a really hard decision about things that were going down, he would sit and turn his chair and look out the window and ask, how will I feel if I add to that number? Like, if I add to the number of white stones in that field, was this decision worth it? And I remember thinking that I had never in my life had to conceptualize something like that. Like, I've never had to look out a window at a cemetery and go, if I make that cemetery bigger, is that okay? And that's quite the conversation to have in your own head.
Right. Well, and I think that people too are kind of a little black and white in this, where they have this idea that these generals, these presidents, etc., are sending these people off to die, and they don't care. Whatever. And as long as it's successful, and if it's successful, then they really don't care. And I don't think that that's the truth. I think that, especially having read these accounts of these men where they're sending, and women now, sure, when they're sending these people off to die, even if they're successful, even Normandy was a great success and turned the tides, yada yada, went down in history. But he still was not. He still wasn't, singing in the rain after that whole thing went down. Like, it still was a very heavy thing. And it's the same with the atomic bombs in Japan. This idea that, like, we did that and we were like, yeah, we got them. Yeah, but there's definitely people who are like, ugh, God have mercy on us over that sort of thing.
We'll talk about it in a later chapter, but I kind of want to bring it up now because I think it really can it talks about this really well, and that in a many ways, there's two people that we talk about and that we remember throughout history, and with very few exceptions, everyone that you can name, you can name them because they're one of two things, and that is that they were either a communicator or a conqueror. They were either a commander, they either did something crazy hard, like we're talking about, the Normandy, the George Washington. They either led troops in battle and took the hill, or they wrote really well about it. And that's everyone from, Plato, Socrates, every philosopher. You can think deep thoughts, but if you can't communicate them, it doesn't actually matter. And you can be an amazing tactician, but if you can't communicate your goal and your idea to the troops and to the people, it also doesn't matter. So at the end of the day, these people, the commanders, the conquerors, the communicators, they largely are the same type of person, and that is a person that can look at the situation and see an opportunity when everyone else just sees roadblocks. There are so many people that wouldn't have done Normandy because the cost was too high. And there's a lot of people that would have never done Hiroshima because the cost was too high. And now there's a lot of people who go like, and they shouldn't have. Right. But we don't get to,
right.
We don't know. There's a lot of people, and obviously there's massive atrocities that we can say that was messed up. But at the end of the day, the communicator, the conqueror, the commander, all of them have this ability, and that is to articulate a thought that other people aren't capable or willing to tackle, because it's either too hard or too big or too obscure. These people, I'm sure, I don't know of this, I'm sure if I read a bunch of World War II books, I'd find the advisors that said Normandy is a terrible idea.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like, there's got to be another way. Was there? We don't know. Normandy worked. But like, the question really, really becomes, it's not really a question. It's a statement of the people that won these wars, every one of them, from the Civil War through the World War I, World War II, here's all of these people. These victories and these failures were by people who were willing to look at the situation in a way that no one else was. And that exact same ability is the same ability that what ostracizes some elevates others. And that's the concept that I love to.
Yeah. And part of that, looking at things the way that other people won't, is having the stomach to do the hard things, having the stomach to add stones to that cemetery.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen Arlington, but it's kind of a sight to see. Yeah. Do you have what it takes to make that decision? I don't know that I do, but it's probably good that there are people that are.
And it's a really interesting position to be in, because you don't want someone who would readily make that decision.
No, you don't want someone that would take it lightly. Like Patton, who was all about it. I remember there's a scene in the movie, but it was a true story thing of how one of Patton's troops was kind of crying, at the horror of it, and Patton slapped him, and he's like, there's no cowards in my army. There's no, like, war is too important to be fought by politicians. Like, there was glory in it. And that's a terrifying thought, the glory in battle, but it's also a very prevalent thought throughout history. So
see, and I having not seen the movie.
You should. It's interesting. It's good.
Oh, I do want to see it. Fun fact, my great-grandfather's pictured in the Patton Museum up here. I want to say that it makes sense that Patton did that, and I may have done the same thing. You have to give someone something to fight for.
Okay. I like that. Patton's son, George Patton Jr., criticized my father. That's one of my dad's claim to fames. When he was a young Army officer, Patton Jr. Looked at him and said, I can't remember if he was a lieutenant or a captain. He's like, don't do stupid things. Like, so my father, my entire life, don't do stupid things. Who told me that? Patton.
Yeah, I think that there's a problem today where we see things like what Patton did, smacking that kid. And here's the thing, like contextually, if Patton would have done that to the same person crying at a TGIFs on a Sunday, okay, that's not okay.
I'm sorry. Why did we go with TGIF? Like, okay, cool. If
Yeah.
Patton in full military regalia
Yeah.
was happened to be at a quaint bistro on a Sunday afternoon, okay, continue.
It wouldn't have been okay. But when you're in that situation,
No, it
did
takes
he do the wrong thing?
it takes a metal. It takes a concept that I don't know many of us are prepared for. And what's interesting, again, to kind of go back to there was a line that I wanted to re-hit. That I want to. We've talked a lot about it, and we've gone through pretty much every war in American history. Not really, but we've touched on most of them. In some, the title of this chapter is History 001. The stories my professors thought were important, told in a way that proves their point, and tested on to assure I saw things their way. We talked last week a little bit about Benedict Arnold and the other thing. The number of stories that do not support the narrative that we teach, the number of stories that like we just talked about with the Enola Gay and Hiroshima, like we could teach that history in a very different context. And some people are teaching that in a very different context. Is it important? Is a diversity of thought on these matters is important, or is it necessary or short-sighted for us to question and kick back against the past narrative? Should we be having the was Hiroshima necessary conversation, or should we accept that it happened and move on?
I think that we should be having the conversation. I don't think that we should be coming down on either side. I think that there are some things in history that we have to be willing to say, we don't know. And the reason I think that we need to have the conversation is so that we are more informed and that we weigh these options in the future. But I think the reason why we shouldn't come down on either side is so that that strong attitude, let's say that tomorrow, the entire United States public school system starts to teach that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were evil. They were awful. We should apologize. I think we have apologized, but you know what I mean? Like we should.
Yeah, but yes, I get your point.
So then we have little Tommy, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Then we have little Susie grow up and be president. And she has to drop a bomb on someone and she thinks, you know what, but they did this in Hiroshima and it was evil. I'm not going to do it. Right. I think that we have to instill critical thinking and give people the information and allow them to make up their own damn minds. Allow them to exercise that and really normalize being like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if that would have been this or that. And I don't know if I have an opinion on it right now. I have an opinion. My opinion might change. I don't have an opinion. I might form an opinion. Normalize all of that instead of having this idea that we must teach history, science, literature in a way that supports one narrative over the other.
Right. No, and it is an interesting, and we'll get into education again in further chapters. We get into why we teach things the way we teach things and should we be teaching them different. But there's a lot to be said for what you just said, is that teaching the full context of history is important, but judging history from our stoop of current, our woke status of looking back and saying, oh, we know so much better now, I feel is disingenuous in general, because we cannot understand, even with the full context, we will never have the perception and the perspective that they had, because we know more and differently and were raised in a different atmosphere than they were.
Right. Reject presentism. But we all love presentism.
I expound on that. I love it.
Which one? Rejecting presentism or presentism in and of itself?
Sure. I meant reject presentism, but yeah, start with what presentism is, and then we'll talk about why reject it.
And I could be totally wrong here because I've been known to be wrong, but presentism is when we basically look to the past, but we look through the moral and ethical lens of the present, when we
Absolutely.
judge the actions of the past by the present. And I like to actually think of this as the opposite, kind of like the evil twin of another evil twin that I like to call pasturbation, which is when we look at the past
Love
with
this. Yes.
yeah, with rosy colored glasses, and we always have this idea of, can't we just return to that amazing time in the past when everything was right and everything was, so it's like presentism and pasturbation, two sides of the same coin that we need to reject.
No, and it's I remember, and I'm not trying to get this all, mature audiences real fast, but like I think I read excerpts from, I've never read the whole thing, but are you familiar with the Kinsey report and what the Kinsey report is?
Yes.
It's so fascinating to me, when the Kinsey report was written. So for those who are unfamiliar, Albert Kinsey, basically he was an entomologist who did a full-fledged study on the sex life of Americans at a time when it was Donna Reed and Leave It to Beaver, and it was very, the Atomic Family, and found out that the entire social narrative was bullshit. Like that there was way more sex happening and way more masturbation happening, and way more that even the public persona of the people at the time wasn't true. And so now we look back to the media of that time. And again, we'll get to that more deeply in further chapters. We look to the past and we look to those chapters, and we look at this glossy, communicated, personified, 1955 Back to the Future that wasn't even true in 1955. And yeah, I love it. We need to reject that people back then were that different than us. And at the same time, we also need to reject that we have any idea what it was like to be them, because both are impossible. You okay?
Yeah, sorry, allergies. No, it was just so beautiful. So yes, I mean, that's one of the things that we need to do, but we also need to stop giving moral judgment to the past, and namely to the people of the past and to their actions. One of my favorite things is when people like to misuse the word, can I even say this on YouTube?
Let's find out.
When people like to misuse the word pedophile.
Oh,
and when they like to apply
this
it to
one bothers me so much. Yes.
Yeah, and when they like to apply it to people of the past. That is presentism 101.
Yeah.
And it annoys me because pedophilia has a very exact meaning for a reason.
Right.
And it's not the same thing as a young child, a teenager, versus a
pre-adolescent versus post-adolescent.
Prepubescent child. Two very different things. We actually do this, by the way, side rant. We do this when we talk about child brides. So you'll hear about like, oh, there's so many child marriages in the US. Did you know they count anything under 18?
Right.
But when you say child marriage, you think a 9-year-old.
Right.
But when you say child marriage, you really mean an 18-year-old.
Right.
So it gives like a really false.
No, and I tried to have this conversation on TikTok a few months ago, and I got just spit roasted.
Is it about Joseph Smith?
Yeah. I got spit roasted by so many angry people. I was like, you know what? Never mind. I'm going to tap out because you're all wrong, but no one's going to listen to me on this one.
Maybe I'll make a video because I mean, it actually does bother me, but it's one of those things that I've brought up before in conversation where people do not take kindly to it, because the assumption is, it's kind of like Jeff's comment. I'm picking on you again, Jeff. It's kind of like Jeff's comment where people would assume, oh, you don't think World War II is important? Why do you hate the Jews? It's kind of like, oh, you don't think that a 40-year-old man sleeping with a 15-year-old is pedophilia? Why do you support pedos?
What's really funny is that like several months, about 2 months ago, I made a whole TikTok about World War II and about the war with a logo. And Jeff and I did about 7 different rounds of it before I scrapped it because of this exact conversation. It was like, there is literally no way for a cisgendered white guy in 2020 to make this argument without it sounding like I'm diminishing which I wasn't. I was just like, I was trying to talk about, I was like, I know what's going to happen in my comment section. And no, thank you. Like, it's not the hill to die on. I was trying to be quippy. about World War II. And it's like, there's just no way this comes off as anything but derogatory, which it super wasn't. But 60 seconds is not a long enough time to make my point.
Nuance and all that.
Yeah. You know, it wasn't even No Take November anymore. For those who are on TikTok, you get that joke. So we have 15 minutes left in the show. So we've kind of been all over the place, which is our whole modus operandi. It's what I love talking about. I never know where it's going to go, which is part of the brilliance of it. But I want to make sure, again, I keep grabbing it because I want to make sure that we kind of wrap it out to the point of Charles Beard. It wasn't so far as discredited, but he was suppressed. Dissenting opinions on history, World War II, whether or not we should have dropped the bomb, whether or not we should have done Normandy, whether or not we should have entered the war in the first place, was largely debated, and those who disagreed suppressed. We have this lizard brain that wants us to stay in society and makes us afraid of being left out in the cold. But we also have a system that heralds those that break through it. I'm trying to come up with a question here. From an intellectual state. So you said it very well. We need to stop judging history. We need to stop putting history down, putting the decisions of the people in the past down. Moving forward, though, as we look at history, what should we be incorporating? How much should we? Do we just listen to the textbooks? How much is it our job to contextualize and conceptualize and fill that out? And am I making any sense? I think I'm just rambling at this point.
Well, it's kind of impossible. I mean, because ideally we would understand history in context. We wouldn't just talk about, the conquistadors. We would talk about why Spain went freaking crazy. We would talk about, all of the things, but we don't. And honestly, it's because we don't have time. There's a lot of freaking history to cover.
Right.
There's a lot of things going on to cover.
Right.
And I mean, so like ideally, that would be great. But I think that going forward, we need to, first of all, remove our own, which is impossible, but as best we can, remove our own moral judgment from history and the people in history. But we also need to, and this is very, very difficult, not cherry pick. We need to look at things like history and science, even literature, with a blank slate instead of going in trying to prove or disprove something. And I think that we all kind of only really investigate these things when we're trying to prove or disprove something. It's basically going in and saying, how can I use this? How can I use history? How can I use science? How can I use literature? How can I use philosophy? What if, just spitballing, what if we just learned it? What if we just had an inquisitive mind and wanted to know?
To what end? If I can't use my information to beat my opponents, then I don't understand what the point of knowing things is.
You will be able to use it to beat your opponents.
I was joking.
Well, listen. No, it's just I'm saying like the investigation part of it.
Yeah.
Obviously, any knowledge that we acquire, we use in one way or another.
There is no knowledge which is not power. Truly, there is just the understanding of something. There is no knowledge that is not power, and there is no understanding that doesn't lend to understanding, axiomatic and recursive as that concept is. But I love that. I think it's important to understand. Yes. The lizard brain is kind of an interesting concept that I ended this chapter with of we have the neocortex, which is our higher brain. It's what we think with, it's what we reason with, it's what we logic with, it's what we it's what this conversation is largely based off. But the limbic system, the deeper system, is all emotions. It's guttural. It's why the skin, the hair stands up on your arms, and you feel that tingling in your neck. It's what makes you afraid. It's what drives you. And every decision, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, every decision is not made by the neurocortex. They're all made by the limbic system. They're all made from that gut feeling. So it comes down to, we contextualize history. We try to make it make sense to us, but really at the end of the day, it's about those feelings. It's about those knee-jerk reactions. It's about the things that push us, drive us, force us to act. And about learning to harness that or avoid those things. Again, trying to turn that into a question.
Well, I can turn it into an answer.
Do that.
I really think that one of the things that we do using that is make these knee-jerk decisions about history and historical things in their context and how they affect us today.
Sure.
And one of the best ways that you know that someone is doing that is when they are absolutely rigid, unwilling to look at another side of it.
Oh, absolutely.
So, and this is both the positive, the George Washington is our czar or whatever, not our czar, I'm sorry, our Caesar.
I like czar too, for the record,
but also the other side of it where George Washington is literally Hitler. So
absolutely.
literally.
Yeah.
And so we have to understand that we're going off of emotionalism when we do that. I guess you called it lizard brain, which is fancy schmancy. I call it emotionalism. We need
lizard
those
brain's just cuter because I can think of the gecko and like the Geico lizard, and I'm just like, hey, yeah, I gotcha.
That's cute that that's what you think of, because I think of a freaking iguana, and I'm terrified of iguanas from childhood.
I'm terrified of bees, so I win. Like, iguanas are actually scary. Bees are not.
Like, bees are scary if you're allergic.
I am not.
But yeah, I think that if you, okay, let's take American history. American history is full of some awful crap. Really awful crap. If you're unwilling to see the good and neutral parts of American history, you're not being logical. You're not being reasonable. You're completely going off of the emotionalism. And the opposite is true. If you only want to see the good in American history, if you want to do that
Star-Spangled Awesome,
then you're not being logical. You're not being reasonable. You're going completely off of emotionalism. The question is, did your information come from, like, did you get your narrative from information, or did your narrative feed the information gathering that you did?
I love it. No, I mean, and I like that is when you look at this situation, can you not see it another way? Can you not, are you locked into it, and that's the emotionalism, or are you able to conceptualize an alternative approach? Are you able to see it from a different view? My question there would be, and I don't want to come up with an example because that's like, whether it is abortion, gun control, or pick your hot button topic. When you are completely incapable of seeing another viewpoint, does that mean your viewpoint is righteous and correct? Or does that mean that you are blinded by your like being completely of one mind about something? Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
Right. Because you can be right for the wrong reasons.
Right. Like, I think we can say, like, well, murder is wrong. Well, there are probably people who had it coming. Like, it's an interesting way of thinking about it. If you are of so one mind about something, one complete thing, does that mean, is that a red flag that you should think about it more? Or is that a green flag that you clearly have a solid understanding? And I don't know that there's
I have a story about this.
Hit me.
So I am always trying to poke holes in my deeply held beliefs.
Sure.
Religious, political, historical, whatever. So a few years back, I did this with Hitler.
Okay.
I was like, Hitler, greatest evil. Oh my gosh. And I caught myself saying these regurgitating what I had heard my whole life. And so I thought, was Hitler really that bad? I decided to go off of that question. Was Hitler really that bad? I wrote it on the top of a piece of paper.
Okay.
And I started looking.
How'd that go?
He was an asshole.
Yeah.
But he wasn't the devil incarnate. There's a lot of things with Hitler that are really interesting to me. A lot of things with Hitler that are really interesting to me. His mental health issues, the fact that, so you remember how we were talking earlier, circling back to King George, how we were talking earlier, how it was Parliament and King George was more like meh, but how he was the front, so he got all the things, but really
Right.
a lot of times the front person isn't as bad as the people that are making the rules behind him.
Right.
Hitler was bad, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to excuse it or justify him, but the people behind him were really bad.
No, yeah. You can't, you need a driving force behind that kind of, you can be the tip of the spear all you want, but you've got to have a pretty solid mass behind you to be that evil. It is 10:25, so I would kind of want to like wrap it up and say, on that note, I suppose we've done that 2 weeks in a row now, like, and now that we've brought everyone down, but again, I'm going to pull this up real quick. The book is The Very Best Bad Idea. Maggie and I are going to be talking about it for the next few weeks, kind of one chapter, 2 chapters at a time. This week was History 001, just the concepts of history and why we teach it the way that we do. Next week, we'll be talking about how to change your mind and how the great philosophers and what they added to the conversation, like Bill S. Preston and Theodore Logan, will be discussed. They will, because they were the greatest philosophers of all kind. If you don't get that joke, I'm sorry. So next Tuesday, whatever time, 9 o'clock my time, 9 o'clock Eastern, 9 to 10:30 Eastern, or 6 o'clock to 8:30. Yes, 7:30. Whatever time. Why do you have to live so far away, Maggie? Damn.
I know.
But yeah, so, and again, to say one more time, if you pick up a book right now, it is, and use code TikTok, where Maggie and I met, hashtag TikTok, it is like 30% off, and it comes to Face to Buy Me. So this has been awesome again, and we will see you next week. Yes? See you, Maggie. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.